If there was only one skill I could have as a writer, it would be the ability to create compelling characters. And to me, the essence of a compelling character is complexity. When I sat down to watch House of the Dragon, I was expecting to love the dragons, I was expecting to love the setting, but I wasn't expecting to fall in love with Daemon Targaryen as much as I did. Played by Matt Smith, I've always seen him as the Doctor Who guy, but his portrayal of Daemon Targaryen is utterly captivating. So much so that I would probably say he's my favorite character in the show. So as I watched House of the Dragon, I became obsessed with trying to figure out why. Why was Daemon Targaryen so captivating? In a world full of interesting, compelling characters, why was Daemon Targaryen standing out? And how could I learn from this to create equally compelling characters in my own fantasy novels? After a lot of analysis, I've boiled it down to 5 key principles. And as I write my current novel, Kingdom of Dragons, I'll be planning to use these principles to try to improve the depth and quality of my own characterization. Principle number 1, contradiction creates dimensions. We often describe a good character as 3-dimensional and a bad character as 1-dimensional. But what does a dimension actually mean? In story, Robert McKee basically describes a really useful way of thinking about character dimensions, which totally transformed the way that I looked at it. Dimension means contradiction, either within deep character, such as guilt-ridden ambition, or between characterization and deep character, like a charming thief. Dimensions fascinate. Contradictions in nature or behavior rivet the audience's concentration. Looking at Daemon, I think we can see that there's probably these 5 main contradictions that are sort of running through his character. The first one is noble versus crass. He's part of the royal family, but he often behaves in quite a vulgar way that is unbefitting of his station. Number 2, subverts versus respects. On one hand, he really kind of tries to sow a lot of chaos into his brother's rule, and there's one point where he even insults his brother by basically calling his dead son
the heir for a day.
And this is a huge deal, and it's like a massive insult that gets him exiled from King's Landing. But yet later on in the series, he actually kind of comes around and shows a bit more loyalty towards his brother when he basically hands over the crown that he has won for becoming the King of the Narrow Sea. Number 3, lust versus impotence. There's one scene where he tries to seduce his niece, Rhaenyra. She seems kind of into it, but Daemon is unable to consummate the affair. Number 4 is duty versus love. He is married to a woman for political purposes, but on the side he has a mistress with whom he genuinely seems to have some sort of loving connection with. And number 5 is trickster versus supportive. So earlier on, he's very much this chaotic figure who is causing the guard to basically go through the city and be way too heavy-handed with trying to keep the city safe. But as the series progresses, we actually see him becoming a lot more mature. He goes from being this person who steals dragon eggs and wages unsanctioned wars to actually being quite supportive to his family in many instances. And in particular, we see this in episode 8, where his brother, the king, makes this dramatic entrance into the throne room after everyone thinks that he's too ill.
King Viserys of House Targaryen, the first of his name.
This was probably my favorite scene in the series by far, where Viserys is just hobbling up to the throne and he's really struggling, but he's determined to get there. And he drops his crown and he's struggling to pick it back up. And who is it that comes and helps him and puts the crown back on his head? But Daemon, the brother who once spited him in many ways, has now come back full circle to actually showing his love and support for him in this incredibly important time. Now, there's a lot more there that we could unpack, but the key point there is that, like us, Daemon has multiple competing desires tearing at him from the inside. And that's what makes him so interesting to watch and follow. What I just did there, where I sort of listed out those contradictions, that's actually an exercise I do with my own novels and my own characters. And I find it's really useful as a way to quickly add depth and interest to the people that I'm writing about. Principle 2, the 3 sliders. Fantasy author Brandon Sanderson describes this method of characterization where you can kind of plot where a character is on these 3 different axes. Number 1, competence. How easily does the character achieve their goals? Number 2 is proactivity. How much is the character progressing the story? And then lastly is sympathy. How much do we like them? How much would we want to actually hang out with them in real life? Now, according to Sanderson, if you max out all 3 sliders, so you have a character who is super competent, super proactive, and super likable, you actually end up with a pretty boring, flat character with no real flaws. So Superman quite often falls into this category. He's very competent, he's very likable, and he's very proactive. And as a result, his stories generally are less compelling than a character like Batman, who is very competent, is very proactive, but is not necessarily that likable. You wouldn't really want to be his friend. If we look at Daemon in the first episode of House of the Dragon, he's very competent as he displays strong jousting skills in the tournament, and he's also very proactive. You know, he's leading the City Watch to brutally enforce law and order in King's Landing, and he's insulting his brother the King, which results in his own banishment. Then when it comes to sympathy, he is basically a 0 at this stage in the series. He is, you know, sort of the chief asshole of the first episode, just making King's Landing kind of a nightmare for everyone else and really just being super rude to everybody. What's interesting is that these 3 sliders are constantly changing. So as the series progresses, in some ways he becomes far more likable, and then often in the episodes where he is kind of the most likable, the most sympathetic, sometimes he's the least proactive. So what we're seeing is that even though the sliders are consistently changing around, it's often never a case of all 3 being up, but rather 1's up and 2 are down, or 2 are up and 1 is down. And that contributes to him feeling complex and feeling like he's sort of evolving and changing over time. Principle 3, unique reactions. So the inspiration for this video actually came from what seems like an incredibly minor moment at the start of episode 7. Just for a bit of context, Lady Laena, who is Daemon's wife, has just died. And all the characters are gathered around at a funeral, listening to a celebrant sort of give a blessing over the dead Lady Laena. And the celebrant kind of takes this as an opportunity to have this not so subtle dig at Princess Rhaenyra and her bastard sons, basically calling into question the legitimacy of their descent. And everyone else is a little bit taken aback, kind of freaked out by this, but no one really, you know, does anything because it's a funeral, it's not like the right time to kind of protest. But Daemon, on the other hand, he just sort of sits there and chuckles to himself. And that moment, I thought it was so compelling. You know, here Daemon is at his wife's own funeral, and he's chuckling at the absurdity of this cutthroat, ridiculous political game that never stops, even after someone has just died. This is an incredibly unique reaction, and it's in moments like this where everyone else is zagging that Daemon chooses to zig, and that's why he's so interesting to watch. Principle 4, strong desires. In real life, we're generally quite attracted to people with these strong goals and visions of their future, and in fiction, it's no different. Characters with strong, deeply held goals tend to rivet our attention. There's inherent conflict anytime a character expresses a strong desire. Will they get this thing? Will they fail to get this? And what will the consequences be of their pursuit? Almost every character in House of the Dragon has incredibly strong and compelling goals, which is one of the reasons why the show is so fascinating and fun to watch. Now, that might sound like a very obvious point, but you would be pretty surprised at the number of stories where not every character really has clearly defined goals. Quite often, characters can just fall into being like, I'm the person who will give you a message, even though there's no motivation for me to do that. You really want to avoid that. In your own stories, you want to make sure that every character is actually kind of following what their goals are for that narrative. As Kurt Vonnegut said, every character should want something, even if it is only a glass of water. Daemon's goals are particularly interesting and worth noting because his desires have this extra layer of complexity to them. Lots of characters want the Iron Throne, but Daemon is the only one who is the brother to the king who sits upon that throne, which adds in all these extra nuances and tensions to his kind of initial, desire for power. And then of course we see that desire sort of shift over time to the point where he is no longer trying to actively pursue this goal. Which brings me quite neatly to the next and final principle. Principle number 5, change. House of the Dragon goes through several time jumps between episodes, and initially this was kind of strange to get used to, but I really like the fact that they've done this. It makes the story feel like it is truly epic in scope and scale. And my friend Jules had this really good point that pretty much every time you see Daemon after one of these time jumps, he wants something a bit different. Now, you could maybe make the argument that, this is weak writing, like this means his character is inconsistent, but I don't think that's the case at all. I actually think that this is a perfect reflection of how Daemon, much like us, wants different things as he grows older. In real life, our goals and priorities are constantly shifting, and when you look back on who you were 5 years ago, chances are you're probably quite embarrassed by how naive that person was or how immature that person was. And I think Daemon is so utterly compelling and captivating because he's the exact same. In the first episode, everyone kind of, calls him the rogue prince because he's just chaotic and he's just causing trouble all throughout King's Landing. But over time, he matures. When he pledges allegiance to his brother the king after conquering the Stepstones, we actually see this progression and this new kind of resolve within him. He becomes someone who is capable of triumphing over his own ego. When he's with his wife Laena, we see genuine tenderness and affection, which is in sharp contrast to early in the series where he hates his wife and kills her. Basically what I'm saying here is that Daemon traverses this arc from being disrespectful and quite despicable early on to actually becoming extremely likable as the series progresses. Obviously he's done some messed up things, but he actually gets to the point where you're rooting for him to succeed. When it comes down to it, stories are fundamentally about characters wanting something and seeing how they change as they progress towards it. And that's the dynamic that makes Daemon Targaryen so compelling in House of the Dragon. Thanks for watching. If you're new to this channel, my name is Jed. I'm a fantasy author and game writer, and on this channel I host a writing advice podcast every Monday. I'm also doing more of these kind of solo style writing advice videos like the one you just watched. If you'd like some more thoughts on writing compelling characters, check out this podcast interview I did with Joe Abercrombie. Many people would consider him the successor to George R.R. Martin, and I am in that camp as well. See you in the next video. Cheers.